and welcome to episode 147 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is John Dinning in Los Angeles. How you doing up there, buddy?
John, I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm hanging in there, slowly reacclimating to West Coast time for a couple weeks elsewhere.
Yeah, you were out of the country for a while.
I was, out of the country and out of my mind. It was wonderful. We had quite a time.
I'll take that as a good trip.
Yep.
And then you get to come back, and aside from all the rain in California, now we've got the LSAT.
Yep. Limped straight into February LSAT territory, which is, of course, what brings us here today.
Yeah, I definitely limped in because I had no power or internet for 3 days. That was both great and terrible.
Yeah, I remember we were worried that I might have to do this whole thing solo if you were still off the grid. Glad to have you back.
Yes, I came back, and so first off, obviously, we need to figure out what we're going to drink for this recap of the February LSAT episode. What are you drinking?
I think you and I were inspired by the same thing, although we went in slightly different directions. As we'll discuss, there was a logical reasoning question about liver cirrhosis, always fun to read, but specifically about, I think, the mitigating effects of caffeine on it. So you and I have decided to go down that path. I've got an Irish coffee, so some caffeine, but also some Jameson and a bit of Bailey's in there. So that's my nod to the liver cirrhosis question.
That comment strikes me as we took lemons and made limoncello out of it.
That's right. Vodka lemonades.
Speaking of vodka, that's what I'm drinking, a vodka and Red Bull, although I've kind of made it a special orange version by using Absolute Mandarin, which is kind of like that, got that little extra orange to it. So very, very powerful, energizing drink with caffeine in it and taurine and about 87 other things.
A Mandarin Bull, is that what that is?
Mandarin Bull is what that is called.
There you go. Good for you. While we're staying topical, I think the song choice was also inspired by recent events, very recent events, in fact. I'm surprisingly feeling pretty good for the day after the Super Bowl. It's always an uncertain bet. But we watched the halftime show, and we're texting back and forth during it. Of course, Usher closed the show out by bringing out his pals Lil Jon and Ludacris for that classic old hit. And I didn't realize this was just the title of it. It seems a little uninspired. The title's just Yeah.
Yeah.
You can do the Lil Jon impression.
No, I'm not going to do that.
Okay, me neither.
Maybe last night I would have after, 3 or 4 Mandarin Bowls.
There you go.
But not today.
That's a great, hype up song. So hopefully anybody who's maybe in the dumps about February can at least play that, and get their spirits up for a couple minutes.
Well, I live in 49ers country, and I can tell you there are a number of people who are down in the dumps who need a lift today.
Well, you should be one of them because you and I had a bet, and I finally won one.
You did, and, I'm not a 49ers fan, so I'm not really chafed about the fact that they lost, but they shouldn't have lost. That's all I have to say about that, and I shouldn't have lost that bet to you.
I'm not a Chiefs fan, but I do like winning money from you.
Well, never bet against Mahomes with the ball in the fourth quarter.
Truly.
In any event, let's get to the LSAT world and see what is going on there. Obviously, the Feb LSAT has just passed us by. There still is a makeup date that is coming in a week or so. And then scores will come out at the end of the month, almost the end of the month, on February 28th. Since it is a leap year. And then you've got the April LSAT, which is our next one that is up. The registration for April actually will close the day after the February LSAT scores are released. So it'll close on Thursday, February 29th. That test is in the second week of April. It's April 11th, 12th, and 13th. And then scores come back in early May, and then you have the June LSAT, which is the following test after that, and that is the last test, John, that will have logic games as a scored section in our era. Mm-hmm. It's really the end of the first week in June, and then scores for that come back at the end of June on June 26th. Various uses for these tests. Obviously, any of them can be used for next cycle. The February LSAT scores that we're getting, some people are using them for initial applications. Some are using it to improve their standings. Seeing a lot of people using April and June, thinking about things like scholarship reconsideration, as well as kind of getting off the wait list, kind of things like that. So still a lot of effects on this particular cycle to happen.
Yeah, and of course, the removal of games after June adds a certain sense of urgency for those who are pretty proficient with the logic game section, or those who optimistically feel like they could become so. So I will reiterate some advice that we've been giving the past several episodes, which is if you're on the fence and think you could improve games, which is very, very likely to be the case, get signed up for June. Don't let this opportunity pass you by because come August, games are gone and there is no redemption in that section for you beyond then.
It's all LR and RC at that point.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, based on some of the patterns that we're seeing in the logical reasoning, LSAC has said, oh, it's going to be exactly the same LR as it is now. I'm not entirely certain about that. I'm seeing a lot more formal logic, a lot more numbers-based questions that they are playing around with and experimenting with, almost as if they're bringing in some of the logic games elements into LR questions. And anybody who had experimental LR knows what I'm talking about. You probably saw a few questions in that vein. That same was the case back in January as well. I think they're going to start putting it into a little bit more of that formal logic, highly structured type of problem scenarios that is kind of harkens towards logic games. So I don't think it's all of a sudden you get a whole lot easier where everybody's like, oh, no more logic games, I'll just go kill it. They're going to make sure they have some elements of it, which, John, is honestly a conversation for another day because it goes to the heart of test validity and what removing logic games means, but we're not going to delve into that now.
Yeah. We may delve into it at some point, though, because I know you and I both have some thoughts. But for another time. No, we are not.
However, if you are taking any of these LSATs that are coming up, not just April and June, but also beyond, there's a number of free seminars that we have that are rolling through over the next few months. On February 20th, we've got a Logic Games webinar on circular games. On the 28th, we've got one on comparative reading and reading comprehension. John, you and I will once again get behind the microphones for a crystal ball that will focus on the April and June LSATs. That is coming up on March 6th. That is free to the public. You can sign up for that on our website at powerscore.com/free seminars. And then you got a couple more throughout March. We've got a logical reasoning common flaws webinar on the 19th. We've got the LSAT 101 for the new LSAT, the non-logic games LSAT on April 2nd. And then on April 16th, one of our favorites, the reading comprehension skills test webinar. That'll be useful no matter when you're taking the LSAT in the near future.
Yeah, it's a jam-packed couple of months coming up there with those. I'm really curious to see how people respond to that LSAT 101 for the new test, because again, it's going to really shift priorities, it's going to shift study habits, and we cover all of that in that particular webinar. So that's going to be cool.
Absolutely. Speaking of the LSAT, let's talk about February 2024. First off, let's talk about what this test looked like from a size standpoint and then the actual reality of it. The first thing to know is this wasn't a very big LSAT. That's why it was only 2 days. It was just Friday and Saturday, which I think for our purposes on a personal level was nice.
Yeah, it was great.
4-day LSATs, I don't like them. They're just too much. It's relentless. It's just honestly thousands of messages ultimately and sifting through just a huge amount of information. February LSAT had less going on and it made it a little bit easier for us. I think we were able to relax just a little bit more. But as always, thanks to everybody who sent us messages. We appreciate everything that we receive. That's the easiest way for me to say this. But that first test date on Friday, they're probably looking at about 5,000 people who were scheduled for it. Probably around 4,500 actually sat for the test. The next day, Saturday, unsurprisingly, slightly larger, about 6,000 scheduled. There's always a little bit of a loss, so about 5,500 actually sat for the exam. That brings you up to about 10,000 actual test takers. If you go back to last February, that number was around 9,200. So, a little bit under 10% increase here year over year, which has been very much the story with LSATs in the past few months. I think we're probably going to see that with the next few as well, as people who are good at logic games are like, I'm taking this test now. The one nice thing, John, is small test overall, only 2 days, no systemic problems. This was easily one of the smoothest LSATs I've seen overall since really they switched over to Prometric last August.
Yeah.
So that's good news.
Yeah, you and I are always kind of holding our breath, especially as things kick off on Fridays. or the first day, like Friday in this case. But I didn't see any real major problems. Obviously, some people still ran into proctor issues. That's going to happen no matter how well the test is actually run. There's just going to be human error involved. That's why they have a makeup test next week. And if you did run into proctor errors, whether you lost time or were unable to finish or had some sort of, again, catastrophic event, make sure to submit your complaint through your LSAC account. You can get signed up for the test next week and have another crack at this thing and still get your score back with everyone else at the end of the month.
That's exactly right. And when we say systemic, meaning that hundreds or thousands of people weren't all affected by the same problem, there are still problems. There's always situations where proctors just ghost people, disappear at a break, and then they never come back. Or you try to log in and you're sitting there and no proctor ever shows up. There's obviously disconnection issues that actually happen. So we're not trying to downplay that. We're just saying from a systemic standpoint, we didn't see anything. This was certainly among the best so far. And that's what you want. You want to see them get better every single time, because an LSAT without problems is the way an LSAT should actually be. It shouldn't be like, oh my gosh, I got lucky. No, that should be the default standard. Problems should be the unforeseen
For sure.
kind of occurrence and exception, not what it has been recently. So this was good to see.
Agreed. Yeah, and to put this in perspective for people who are wondering what 10,000 people taking a test actually looks like, if you compare it to last month, January test, it's about half the size of what we saw last month. It was also half as many days, so that tracks. And as we'll see once we get into the content, they reduced a lot of the scored sections that they used as well. So everything here is kind of pared down, made our lives a little easier, as you mentioned.
Absolutely. And, we didn't have as many LSATs going on either. I think we had the international LSAT last month. Yeah. We didn't have that as well. So there was it felt a little bit more standard. So before we get to that discussion of all the content, as always, I will make a quick rundown of just some thoughts that we have about this, some reminders, disclaimers, pieces of advice, way to use and contextualize this information. And the first one is always the same. It says, please do not summarize this online. We think it misses the nuance. We really want people to hear what we have to say directly. It's a free podcast. Just send them to the podcast instead of, quoting what we've said, especially on this test where there is some nuance, again, as with every single one. Also, section order is meaningless, especially for those of you talking online who are like, oh, the first RC was harder than the second. And someone else is like, was it? I thought that was reversed. Well, it probably was reversed, actually. They don't keep things in the same spot. People get different tests. They get different test orders. Even if they have the same content, it can be in a different order. That happens all day long as they weave in new information. Just be aware of it so that when you're talking to someone else about your exam, you realize that you may actually be talking about the same test, but it just was in a wildly different structure. Obviously, now when we talk about information, everything is largely been disclosed online. People have been talking about this test for the last 2 days or so. And so LSAC prefers that we wait until the main testing administration dates are over before, working through this podcast. But one of the things I will always say is we use a variety of pieces of information, from student conversations that we've had, from reports that we get from people who have taken the test, from things we see online, from the database and archive that we have of all prior test uses. As we go through this today, hopefully we've covered every single scored section. If you don't hear your section, it could be maybe that your memory isn't 100% clear. Stress will do that. It could also be that perhaps you had a section that was not widely in use and we didn't hear from you. So if we haven't heard from you, there's no way we can actually cover the content. We think we've gotten it all, but if you don't hear your sections in today's discussion, write us afterwards and let us know so that we can add that information to what we have. When we talk about test difficulty, one of the things that is the case is that taking the real LSAT is always harder, more stressful, more terrible than taking a practice test. It's just not the same thing. And so a negativity bias is going to creep into everything. Everything's going to seem harder to you from the real test. It's going to seem like a worse experience. You're going to feel worse about your performance. Be aware of the fact that that is actually, in a lot of cases, more of an emotional context than a real context. People have walked out of these exams before saying, I did terrible, and they've gotten amazingly high scores. Let's hope you're in that boat. Also, when we talk about easier or harder, we're talking about relative to already a high level of difficulty. We think everything on the LSAT is hard. Some is harder than the others, some sections are a little bit easier than others. But an easier section doesn't mean easy. It just means it wasn't the hardest out there, but it was still hard. So be aware of that when we're talking about these sections. We also know that test makers try to confuse test takers by putting questions on the same topic in different sections. That can make it harder for people to identify which sections they're talking about online. I've seen this numerous times, and I've talked about it repeatedly in past podcasts, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Also, our estimations of what are real and experimental are based on certain assumptions about how they reuse sections, namely that if something was real in the past, when they reuse it, it will be real again. There are a few exceptions to that out there, but they are so rare and they're such edge cases that most people would not have recognized that. I can say this, so far we've not been wrong about identifying real sections. So that's, I think, very good news, at least that we're aware of. And then one last note, the same as the first note, please do not summarize this online. I prefer not to miss the nuance. It drives me crazy. So we just ask that you send people right to this podcast. We even put timestamps online so you can say, hey, it's at minute 10 that they start talking about it, or whatever minute it turns out to be. And on that note, I think I'm going to skip the last comment about future test takers and making notes, since the next LSAT's not for 2 months. John, let's get right to the February 2024 LSAT.
I like it. All right. The way we've typically kicked off these LSAT recap discussions, we did this in January, and really it tracks back to the beginning of our crystal ball webinars and our predictions that we've made, is we try to do an honest self-evaluation. How did our predictions stack up against the reality that unfolded? And happily, up to this point at least, we've been able to really shine a spotlight on our own successes. We've been incredibly accurate, to the point where there was a test last year, or 2 tests last year, where I think they reused 6 different exams, and we named all 6 of them. In January, we predicted every major reuse that they were going to do. So we've got a good track record here. And if you're wondering why I'm introducing it with that preface, it's because this test went a little bit differently. And it went a little bit differently because LSAC did something unusual here. The first thing they did that was unusual is they only reused a single test for this entire February administration. There was new content, as there always is, but anything that we had seen before came from just one source. And that source, this is the other unusual thing, happened to be a test that had been used 4 times already. This, to my knowledge, is the 5th reuse of this content, dating all the way back to September of 2017. So that made this one impossible to predict. The things that we predict are tests that haven't been reused yet, but that we think are coming. That's what happened in January, last November, last October. What happened here was entirely different. And the first instance that we've seen of them actually doing this. So I'm going to give us a little bit of a pass, let us a little off the hook, but I will also freely admit we did not predict this content. You think that's a fair self-assessment?
Sure.
Yeah.
I do think it is, because we talked about it beforehand and we agreed that that was a fair assessment.
Okay. I wanted you on record publicly.
Now, the funny thing about this is that we've said in the crystal balls before that when they start reusing content that's been reused so many times, what it does is it opens the door to them having so many options that we then know we can't make a prediction. What typically happens, though, is whenever they've had a test like this, they usually have other tests that they use, and we end up getting that right. Mm-hmm. As you said, the track record is actually, to me, surprising, if not shocking, that it's been as good as it has been. There's a unique problem with February, though. As I said before, this is a very small test administration. So when they only use one test, and it's one of these, many multi-use tests, the chances of predicting that become like a needle in the haystack. The odds of us making predictions that are correct both grow and diminish from each LSAT depending upon what's going on with the LSAT itself, what's happened with prior tests, and so forth. We did one crystal ball for both January and February. Crushed the January side of it. Then February comes in, and both you and I were like, hard to say whether or not this is going to, how accurate it will be. Yeah. I can say that I had students tell me, hey, the logic games that I practiced were right on the money. They really helped. It's just that we missed the reading comp topics. That was the thing that we didn't really have a good handle on. And you and I both knew beforehand that that was very likely. That's why I think even had we updated it for February alone, I still don't think we would have put this test in there. So I don't think it would have made any difference, whatever. Yeah. So I can look at January and February as a 2-test event and say, hey, January went extraordinarily well, better than I expected. February was so small, it just didn't work out, and feel okay about that. But the last thing that you and I want to do, John, is walk around and say, oh, every single time it's perfect.
Yeah.
That's not the case. No one could do that. I'm always happy to get anything right about any one of these tests, and anybody who said they could do better is, in my opinion, not being honest about it. So I'm okay with where it is. Would I like to get everything right every single time? Yeah, because I would probably retire at that point. At that, you're just telling, here's the whole test. But that's not going to happen, and no one should have that expectation anyway.
Yeah, you made a note, though, about the recommended problem sets, and I do want to reiterate this. The biggest point in these predictions, and we talk about this at every crystal ball, isn't so much that we're going to tell you your reading topics or tell you exactly what the structure of your games are going to be or whatever. What we're trying to really do with that is anticipate the nature of the conceptual underpinnings of the test. And to do that, we put those problem sets in there that we think are best going to mimic what the test makers are up to. And I heard repeated comments from people about reading games, all of it, saying how useful those problem sets were to have reviewed, to have studied and learned. So I think in that regard, the crystal ball was still extremely useful for February. The details, however, did pass us by, so to speak.
Yeah. And keep this in mind when we make those recommended problem sets. Part of it is on tests we think are going to be reused, but that's not all of it.
Yeah.
We also used our general understanding of what's going on in these experimental sections to fill in the remainder of the problem set. So even if we didn't get a test right, we still are going to have content in there that is going to be useful. So it's kind of a dual strategy in terms of the selections that we're doing, which is going to be interesting because, John, over the next month, you and I will sit down and put together the next crystal ball now that we have this test in the books and figure out what we think is going to happen with April and June. And then I would imagine we'll probably do a June mini ball.
I think we will too.
Yeah, we'll have to see. We've got enough time there, and depends on what happens with April, obviously, but that gives us some options. All that aside, John, should we talk about the test?
Yeah, let's start with games, as we always do. And I alluded to it. I can't now recall if I actually mentioned the test that did get reused here. I mentioned that it's been used about 4 times previously. The test that they reused here, for anyone curious, was the January 2021 LSAT Flex, as it was back then. We covered this in podcast episode 77, I believe. So if you're interested in hearing more about that test, although we're about to cover it, we did do this already back in episode 77. So this is a test we're very familiar with. This was the first thing we saw on Friday morning with Logic Games. And Dave, if you want, I'll just go through the 4 real games from that particular test.
Hit it.
All right. 23 questions, probably in this order, although don't hold me to that. Here were the 4 game topics. I believe the first game was about a theater run over 6 weeks, different plays or movies being shown. It was a tricky game in there about upper and lower campus buildings. A lot of people talked about. The toughest game in this section, I believe, was game 3, about paintings and sculptures in different art galleries, and they came from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And then an interesting game to close it out about archaeologists and artifacts that they were studying, things like a flute, a goblet, and there was a knife and a harp, a couple others. Those were the 4 games from that January 21 test that has been reused here. Again, if you got this section, it was real. But of course, as we'll see, there were no experimental games. So if you got any games, they were real. There was another section, though, of new games. And this is the other one that we saw, the only other section of games that we saw. 23 questions, again, all new. Here were the topics. The first game, I believe, was about 7 operas. Then there was a game about psychiatrists and their therapy appointments. 2 psychiatrists' therapy appointments from 1 to 4 p.m., treating patients. There was a game about assigning 4 people to 3 different projects. And then maybe the toughest game of all 8 that we saw, which was the final game in this section. 2 theaters showing 6 movies over a Friday and a Saturday. A lot of people struggled with that theater game. The movies.
A lot of complaints.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not really as many complaints about the first 3 games on that section, but the last one, not a whole lot of love for that last game that's floating around out there. And as you said, no Logic Games experimentals, which is not a surprise. It's going away from the test here in August. We only have 2 more exams now that will have Logic Games on them. They don't probably need to test any more out. If they tested one here, they would have to use it on April or June for it to have any value. So if you start thinking about why am I not seeing Logic Games experimentals, well, the timeline is dying.
Yeah.
The extinction is coming for Logic Games. So event. We don't need to keep trying to procreate them.
All right. Well, there we go. So that's games. Like I said, some tough ones in there. But just those 2 sections were all we saw. If you had a different section of games somehow, We did not hear from you. That's regrettable, but it's not too late. Do please let us know if you saw something else.
Yeah, I don't think we will on logic games unless somebody had like they were one-off tests. So, and if you were, let us know because that would be cool. Let's get into reading comprehension then and take a look at what we have here. You want this one again, John, or you want me to handle it?
You know what? I'm going to let you do LR, so let me take this.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Fine.
And you did that whole laundry list of disclaimers.
Yeah.
So go drink your Mandarin bowl. I'll take this one.
I will do that.
All right. Fair enough. Dave gets a tea break. So let's talk reading comp. Again, with games, we saw 2 real sections. In reading comprehension, same deal. There were 2 scored sections of reading comprehension that we saw. And then, as I'll mention, 1 experimental section of reading comp. Let's start with the real. And I'm going to start again with the January 2021 content that was reused. 27 questions, these 4 passages, I believe in this order. The first one was about West African kente cloth, strip weaving, about African looms and things. The second was about computer-generated simulations being used in courtrooms, more and more in both the US and the UK. The third passage was about medieval music and modern performers, something about polyphonic music and iconography. And then it ended with the comparative passage, passage 4, about the compatibility of fundamental concepts in both physics and chemistry, and whether those 2 things were, in fact, compatible or not. So there you go, 4 passages. If you had that with a second set of reading comp, those 4 passages were the ones that were scored. Those counted.
Exactly.
The other real section of reading comprehension was new content. Again, we've seen some experimental uses of this before, but in terms of scored, this is the first time we've seen it. 27 questions, these 4 passages. And this one actually began with the comparative passage. It was about double jeopardy and punishment for repeat, second-time offenders and recidivism. The second passage, tough, was about toxic honey or mad honey and bees, and about Greek and Roman reports about the nature of poisonous honey and it being dangerous, confirming those reports. The third passage, abstract narratives and traditional versus avant-garde writing styles, which is kind of interesting. And then finally, the passage I'd be most interested in here was the 4th passage, I think 4th. 3 and 4 got a little bit of confusion from people. So this is either the 3rd or the 4th, was about Inca using knots, what's called quipus, as a way of keeping tax records. And I say that interests me because, 9 days ago, I was in Lima, literally in a museum looking at Incan quipus, reading all about them. So
you should have taken this LSAT.
That was oddly serendipitous. Of course, if I had taken it, I'd gotten the West African section and been out of luck. But yeah, that as soon as I saw that passage come up, I was like, I'll be damned. I literally was just in a room surrounded by these things. Those
news to me since I've never heard of them.
There you go. I hadn't until I was in a Museo Larco in the middle of Lima, which I recommend, by the way. And then finally, there was one other section of reading comp that was bouncing around, but it was experimental. Let me run quickly through these. These were typically paired with the passage on the West African kente cloth weaving. The first passage was about Stoicism. It was comparative, so another one that started comparative. Second was about the legal doctrine of neutrality, intention versus effects. The third was about the linguistic color theory, language relativity, universalism got mentioned. And then the fourth, what would easily be my favorite, Fermi's paradox. The idea of if there is intelligent life out there, where are they? Why haven't we heard from them? Statistically, there should be lots, and yet silence. That's the paradox.
Unless it's like a dark forest theory.
Elaborate. Is that like a tree in a forest falls? Do you hear it? What do you mean?
No, the dark forest theory, if I recall correctly, if I'm wrong, somebody correct me, is that intelligent species have decided that the entire universe is probably aggressive and angry, and the best strategy is not to go around making a whole lot of noise, but to be as quiet as possible so that you're like in a dark forest and nobody can see you. Which, of course, is not how humans behave, as we send, radio waves and signals out into the ether.
Yeah, we tend to set dark forests on fire. Neil deGrasse Tyson's explanation of this is that if they're even 2 to 3% genetically superior to us, it would be the equivalent of why don't we go and try to have conversations with chimpanzees? Maybe they see us. Maybe they know we're here and we're just too stupid to be bothered or to bother.
And then, of course, there's the theory that we're so aggressive and adaptive that people find us or aliens find us and immediately say, no, not those people.
Yeah.
We're out.
Don't poke the hornet's nest.
All those theories are great. I love all of them.
I love that the passage we spent the most time just riffing on is one that didn't count at all. Those four, again, Stoicism, neutrality doctrine, linguistic color, and Fermi's paradox, those were all experimental. So again, if that's a section you had, you can discount it. It did not count.
Yeah, and this is probably for some people not happy news, because I think a lot of the double RC people felt that this set of passages was easier. And so when they had these two, they're like, I hope this one, wherever it was, first, second, third, or fourth, I hope that was the real one. And unfortunately, as you said, many of them had the West African kente cloth section along with it. Not saying that was the hardest passage in there, but that is the easiest way for us to kind of identify it here. A lot of people were like, I hope that's experimental. So unfortunately, I realized for some people that wasn't the best news to just receive. But hopefully you were able to, work through the real passage there. And let's hope that when we get to the scale discussion, that we discover that it maybe loosens the scale a little.
We shall see. All right. You want to do LR?
Yes. In fact, I do, John.
Go for it.
And when we look at LR as an overall here, we know that LR is going to be used even more on the future tests. So unsurprisingly, there were at least a couple different experimental sections that were floating around here, but there were also two distinct scored LR sections. So let's take a look at both of those. The first one is the one that initially appeared with that January 2021 Flex LSAT. And there's a number of questions, and I'll just list some of them really out here. First question was about daydreaming and whether people are unhappy when they do it. Question about a lecture being boring and whether or not success comes along with that. Question about raptor claws and climbing, all sorts of variations in there. Bacteria in tap water surviving certain temperatures. Question that a lot of people used as kind of like a touchstone in this to understand which section they had. Meerkats whining and cries, the meaning there. Question about walnuts lowering cholesterol, animals in for-profit zoos, another question you saw a lot of conversation about. And then poetry and monolingualism, speaking multiple languages and so forth. Number of other questions in there. There's certainly some challenging questions, as there always is in LR, but I don't know that this was the hardest LR section that we've ever seen. But that, if you had any of those questions and you can remember where they were on your test, if you had two LRs, that section was real. So that's the first thing. And one thing I'll say that we often cover in the disclaimers is if you're taking these LSATs, jot down some thoughts when the test is done so that you can figure out afterwards what was real and what was not real. If you're like, hey, I had walnuts in section 1 and I loved that section, now you know that section was real and you can move on from there. Now let's take a look at the other section, which was a new usage by them. And some of the questions that we have in there: Watertown, evidence of bores, artificial and natural sweeteners, along with sugar, the aforementioned liver cirrhosis and caffeine that inspired our drink choices because we're sick, bat echolocation and sonar, Darwinian cooperation, a library purchasing computers and books, humans and I think it was actually Europeans and Neanderthals settling in the Arctic, and then questions about violent crime and punishment and deterrence. That section was real as well. So keep that in mind when you take a look at this. If you could figure out, if you had 2LR, which section you had with any of those sets of questions, that was going to be the scored. And we don't typically, John, go through all the experimental sections that are out there, but I'll just note a few questions that we saw in experimentals that did not count. Question about Milky Way galaxy and kind of like infrared telescope photos. This was a non-counting section. Double jeopardy, astrology and zodiac signs, bare facial expressions. That was a section that didn't count overall. Another section that didn't count had questions involving meteorite and like the Libyan desert, animals that use oxygen to generate ATP, question about crystallization structure and sedimentary rock and so forth. That was another section that was experimental. I'm not going to go any further with that, but if you're trying to remember, wait, which was which, those questions that I just mentioned were part of experimental sections. Future LSAT takers will see those as scored. They were not scored for you if you encountered them there. And that's your LR overview.
Let me reiterate one point that you actually made earlier. which is, as we study these experimental sections, they're remarkably revealing for logical reasoning because it is very clear the direction that the test makers are headed in here. And once again, we've seen a test that has these like mini logic game style logical reasoning questions in the experimental. The one that stood out here was about voting, rounds of voting and the different candidates. The one who receives the least votes is dismissed, and those votes get reassigned and redistributed. That read for a lot of people very much like almost a mini logic game scenario with rules. That's what's coming. That is the future of the LSAT, beginning at least in August, possibly even a little sooner. So again, if you saw some of these experimental things and they threw you for a loop, it tells you what you need to start considering if you're taking the test past this June.
John, a couple weeks ago, I actually posted a blog
that
talks about, some of the things that we've seen in LR on the experimental side. And I didn't go too deeply because obviously you and I have been rewriting our LSAT courses in preparation for that upcoming test. And those will be launched relatively soon. But one of the things that I just made a note of was one thing that we have tracked in recent tests, which is this kind of transformation of some of the questions, this focus more on formal logic, more numerical structures. This voting question is a great example of that. And I'm not trying to fearmonger here, but the idea that all of a sudden the loss of logic games is going to make all those concepts go away, I don't think is true. And so one of the things I did in that blog was I actually listed out 5 different questions from prior released LSATs that you can go take a look at. So I put them down by prep test number, section, question number, and then just a brief comment about the topic. Go take a look at those 5 and see how you feel about them. Because for some people, I think they'll be like, I like this. This is a lot more highly structured. In some respects, I feel like it's a little bit more black and white. If you have that type of mind, a more mathematical, logical view of things. If you go to those questions, you take a look at them, they're just a sample, and you don't like them, that's a good example of how we think they're going to, try to attack people in the future and keep some of the LG difficulty on this test. So I wish I could remember what the name of the blog was, but it's one of the most recent ones. It's in there that I wrote. Certainly, it's like, what will LR look like on the new LSAT? I think that's probably, or on the August LSAT, but it is at blog.powerscore.com/LSAT. And on that note, John, should we go through the test matrix?
Let's do it. Yeah, this is easily the fastest we've ever gotten to the matrix in one of these, by the way.
I was going to say, this is the fastest episode
I don't hate
in history.
It. Could be the caffeine.
No. Yeah, that's actually a good point. I'm not sure I'm talking fast or not. All right, let's talk about the matrix and how we actually work it out. What we're attempting to do is to estimate how many questions a test taker can miss to get a 170. It is easiest for us to see difficulty in the upper levels of this test. It is harder to see it in the middle. Obviously, 180, usually the number of misses is so few that there's not much variation. 170 is a really good marker. It's also a score that many people are really shooting for, is kind of like their hopes for like the T14 and so forth. So everything we talk about will be how many questions you can miss. And when we look at this, we start off at a baseline of you can miss 7 questions overall on this or any LSAT to get a 170. And then we make an adjustment. We go through each of the logic games, each of the reading comp, each of the LR, and we say, hey, how would this move that? Would it make it 7 to 8? Would it make it 7 to 6? That kind of stuff. Or would it not have an effect at all? One thing that we always say is this: we are conservative. If we're uncertain, and nobody's ever 100% certain about this, we have strong feelings about certain things, but it's really hard to know for sure. If we're ever uncertain and we're on the border, we'll usually be more conservative. That typically would produce a happier outcome on score release day than being very liberal in terms of the scoring here. So we try to be conservative as far as making that estimate, and that is something that people should be aware of. If I had a choice between saying it's 8 or 9, and I legitimately was like, I am having a hard time saying, I would say that it was 8 that you could miss, not 9. So just be aware of that. John does exactly the same thing. All right. On that note, everybody starts at you can miss 7 questions. Let's see what happens with logic games. That first section that we're going to take a look at was the one from January 2021 with the kind of like the theater run of shows, the upper and lower campus buildings, kind of like the art lectures about the 18th, 19th, 20th century, and the archaeologists and artifacts 23 questions. We think the difficulty overall on this is medium as far as logic games goes. Previously, when we talked about this, we said that does not move the scale. It would keep you at -7, and we're going to adhere to that. Now let's go to the other logic game section. So if you had this will apply to you and not to the people I just talked about. This was the one about the operas, the psychiatrists or psychologists, the 4 people in 3 projects, and then finally the 2 theaters showing movies on Friday and Saturday. John, you and I had some I don't know what to say, difference of opinion on this, but we certainly talked about this one a lot more.
Yeah.
The first 3 games on this are not killers, but the last one certainly is tough.
Yeah.
So we could say, well, for 3 games, that's the majority of it. That's going to be in the middle. Or did we think that last game was so hard that it would move the entire section over by 1? What's your take?
Yeah, and it's interesting here because I'm kind of right in the middle. And I hate to ride the fence when it comes to this because it feels like some degree of like agnosticism, like make a decision. But it's hard to know without actually having done that 4th game. It's hard to know just how difficult for a high-performing student that game truly was. I can tell you I heard from a lot of people who are like, I usually go -0, -1 on games, and that one gave me trouble, which makes me think it could be enough to move the scale by 1 on its own. I know it's going to move the scale lower. When you talk about scores in the 160s and the 150s, this section is going to loosen the scale for those people. At a 170, it's really tough to say. The conservative part of me thinks no.
Yep.
So I'm probably going to give this a 0.5.
Yep. And that's exactly what you and I had kind of come to the conclusion of, which was hard to say for sure at the top level that it's going to move it. If somebody, wanted to argue with me and they were just going wild over the fact that it's going to, I would just say, sure. I do think for sure it moves it lower on down into the 160s because that last game was tough. And I had the same, type of people saying, hey, this was something where I struggled on the last couple of questions. I normally don't have that problem. So at least as far as that goes, we're going to tab it as a 0.5, meaning it's going to keep you at -7 at the 170 level, but if you're not scoring at the 170s, you're going to get a bonus question from this as you move down the scale. So kind of in the middle. And again, this is part of the nuance that we like to kind of give across to people where it's like, it's not just 0 or 1. It's not all binary. All right, so everybody at the 170 level is sitting at -7. Depending on which LG you had, if you're, let's say, a 155, 160, 165 in there, you might have an extra question coming back to you or not, depending on which of these 2 sections you've had. Let's go to reading comprehension. The first of the 2 reading comprehensions that were scored was the African kente cloth and weaving, the computer simulations in court, medieval music, and physics versus chemistry. This was also from January 2021, and when we covered this before, we said, yeah, this one's tough, and it moves the scale by 1. So if you had this, you now went from 7 to you could miss 8 questions to get a 170. So pretty nice there. Let's talk about the other passage set. This was the Double Jeopardy, the Toxic Honey, which sounds fascinating to me, abstract versus traditional narratives, the Inca knots, all that kind of good stuff. I think this was challenging, but in a way, I feel that this was not on the same level as the kente cloth and that this should not move the scale. It should actually have 0 impact. What's your feeling?
I agree with you. Yeah, I heard way too many people talk about this section using words like straightforward, challenging to be sure, but not in a way that was incomprehensible. And if you want a comparative point of reference, I think about that passage set back in January that had like the Lawrence Krauss passage and was just so brutally difficult that we thought it could even move the scale potentially by 2. So we know what real reading comp difficulty looks like in terms of student response and the feedback that we see. This didn't produce that, which makes me think it probably doesn't move the needle at a 170.
No, I think it could probably help out a little bit as you go down lower in the scaling. One of the things that you see is like the way certain passages hit various people. Like that Toxic Honey passage had a lot going on, and I know some people got bogged down in it, trying not to read too much into it, but then being asked to read a little bit into it makes it challenging. Sometimes it's really about the way topics hit you. It might be for a lot of people, hey, that I really felt comfortable, but there's always a group of people who are like, I didn't like that at all. So if that was you, that's okay. That doesn't necessarily mean that you did terribly on this particular set on there. And depending upon where you're scoring, I could see some benefits as the scale moves through this. But we looked at it, thought about it for a while, certainly, discussed the idea of, does this move it at 170? We felt ultimately it didn't. So again, that would keep you really for most everybody at -7 if you had that and either of the games for the 170. And that takes us to the LR, which, again, I would say we didn't find anything that was overly challenging. I saw some certainly challenging stuff in the experimentals, but not at the same level in the regular scored section. The first of those sections was that January 2021 LR with the raptor claws, the bacteria in water, walnuts, meerkats, for-profit zoos, the poetry in multiple languages. No impact on the scale there. And then the other one with the now famous liver cirrhosis and caffeine question, the bat echolocation, the Darwin cooperation, and so forth, that also in the middle, in our estimation, would not move the scale. So if you're going to get a scale movement here, it really comes from either the African kente cloth passage set, or if you had that logic game section that had the theaters showing movies, you might get some movement as you get into the 160s or so. But really, almost everybody here ends up at 7 or 8 with some downscale effects depending upon the particulars of what you had.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, which is always nice. I like when we agree.
Thankfully.
Unless there's money on it and I win, in which case I'm happy.
Whatever, dude.
Yeah.
One win and it's like you're the king of the world all of a sudden.
I will say historically, I think I'm only batting about 100. So I go about 1 for 10 when it comes to our bets.
I didn't have a strong feeling about the game. Let me just say that. But I was happy to take the bet because I did think the 49ers were going to win. And if I'd put a lot of money on it, and unfortunately I didn't, I would have been livid because they should have won. But that's all I have to say about that.
Fair enough. So again, in summation here, I think most people are going to find themselves at a -7. There are some -8s out there. I cannot see a possible combination getting to -9. I'll put it that way.
I like that. That's actually a really good point to make. It doesn't feel like the difficulty was there. A lot of the people that we talked to, a lot of the information that we have about these sections didn't suggest that it was, some kind of historically or really relatively loose test scaling. Remember, the way scales work is that the harder the test is overall, they loosen the scale up to allow for an offset on that. The easier the test is overall from a logical standpoint, they tighten the scale. This seems about the way a lot of LSATs have been recently, in that middle zone, with some exceptions depending upon which sections you had in RC.
There we go.
All right. Scores will come out on Wednesday, February 28th, around 9 a.m. Eastern Time, usually a couple minutes earlier these days. But John, that's it for the February LSAT, one of the shorter podcasts that we've done on a test recap, because just like the test itself, it was short and to the point. Things went pretty smoothly. I'd say I'm happy with it.
I'm happy with it too. I'm also happy to have March off from testing. So we get ourselves a little breather.
Yes, we do. It's time to travel once again. And on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment and a rating as well. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope that this recap was helpful. We hope that you did great on this test. Let us know how things went, and certainly let us know how scores come back on February 28th. In the meantime, stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.